Alright, in this unit we're going to be focusing on invasive species, looking at some terminology, what they are, um, what places would consider a species invasive, are they beneficial, could they be beneficial, are they going to be harmful, those types of things. How they impact predator-prey relationships within an ecosystem, and other relationships as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Uh, Invasive species are going to be termed invasive if they're an organism that is not native to the ecosystem. Their introduction is going to cause some type of negative impact, either economic or environmental harm, usually to the human population. And then, if it's going to cause harm to the human population, it's more than likely also going to cause harm to animal or plant health within that ecosystem as well. The study of invasive species is definitely focused on non-native organisms and their negative impacts to those ecosystems, but ultimately to the human society. Okay, let's get some terms out of the way. An alien species is just going to be any organism, whether it be the reproductive parts of that organism, seeds, spores from plants or fungus, eggs, any type of reproductive parts of an organism, or the organism itself that is not native to that ecosystem. For example, Lizzie, our bearded dragon, she is an alien species. She is not native to this particular ecosystem that she's found in. She is a desert-dwelling reptile. So she's considered an alien species. Whereas native species are going to be organisms that are going to be found naturally within that particular ecosystem. They have been ingrained and they partake in the food webs and food chains. They are a vital chink in the system of that particular ecosystem. Back to Lizzie. Lizzie is an alien species, the bearded dragon, but she's not considered an invasive species. An invasive species is going to be an alien species that is going to cause an economic or environmental harm or have some type of negative impact to the environment plus to human society. So Lizzie being here, the bearded dragon being here, if there were other bearded dragons and they got out into the environment in this area in Frisco, and they were to propagate, okay, having a lot of bearded dragons in the area is not going to have a negative impact because they'll be ingrained into the ecosystem or the food chain, and there will be predators out there that will go after them and keep them in that food chain cycle. Now, yes, the bearded dragons will also eat insects that might be food for other animals, but they'll still be regulated by other predators in the area, so they won't take over. They won't have a negative impact. They won't have a harmful impact on human society. So they would be an alien species, but not an invasive. All right, this perception to cause harm. Yes, the government wants it to look like the idea of controlling and regulating invasive species is adding health to the environment. All right, so even though they're focusing on putting the perception out there that this is trying to be regulated to help the environment, the ultimate underlying focus is it affecting human population within an area? Okay, and then if it is, then yes, it's also going to be affecting plant and animal species within that particular area as well. Okay, and it all comes down to, if they're invasive, what are they providing? If they're going to be invasive, what are they doing? Invasive species, if it doesn't cause harm, we're not going to classify them as invasive. Now, they can be invasive in one particular area. Say, if we're focusing just on the United States, they can be an invasive species in Oklahoma, but that same organism might not be causing harm in Texas, and so we wouldn't classify it here as invasive. If they give us some type of benefit, even if they have some type of negative impact, if the benefit is going to outweigh that negative impact, we're not going to classify them as invasive. Some good examples: a lot of the livestock that's raised here in the U.S., that's raised here in Texas, isn't native to this area. Okay, however, that's a good food source. We're going to definitely outweigh the good with the bad, and we're not going to classify them as invasive. Same thing with crops. Crops grown here in the U.S., different like Kansas and Nebraska, that's going to grow corn. Corn is not a native species. Corn actually evolved from a type of plant found in Mexico. However, it is a very, very beneficial product for consumption, and so we're going to outweigh the good with the bad, and we're going to say that's not an invasive species. On the other side of that coin, there's a type of plant called water hyacinth that has been used in the past for cosmetic reasons, to put on in flower beds and to decorate the front of homes and buildings, because it grows very nicely, and it has colorful flowers and that type of thing for outdoor gardens. Those that can get into water supplies can actually choke the water supply and cause a lot of damage to water ecosystems, lakes, and those types of things. It can take out the oxygen. It can kill off the algae. It can really disrupt food webs and food chains in those water ecosystems if that particular type of plant gets out. So that definitely would be considered invasive. Now, as far as positive, negative economic impacts, if it's an economic impact, that means it's going to cost money. It's going to cost the government money for that to happen, for that to be controlled, to be regulated. And so if that's the case, it's going to be considered invasive as well. We have something that's growing in the lakes in this area: Lake Lavon, Lake Louisville, Lake Texoma. They're called zebra mussels. They kind of look like clams, oysters, but they have black stripes on them, so we call them zebra mussels. They originally became invasive in the United States when they showed up a few years back in the Great Lakes. They came over from some European countries, but what they do is they attach themselves to boating vessels. If those boating vessels aren't cleaned off very well, then they can be transferred to other lakes. Well, they've made it to Texas. What they do is they consume certain types of plant life. They can grow and collect on structures. They definitely take out food sources for other native animals that are found in those lakes. And so that's a big economic impact, because you have to clean it. You have to try to regulate it. It's expensive, and it does have a negative impact on the environment as well. So those would be considered types of economic impacts that an invasive species can cause. If they're migratory animals, like monarch butterflies migrate through Texas down to on their way to Mexico, where the mating grounds are, every year. Non-invasive species, because they're just passing through. Even if they stop and consume food, they're not a permanent resident. They're just migrating, so they're not going to be considered invasive. Canada geese also fly through on their migratory patterns through Texas. Not going to be invasive. Okay, whereas once domesticated animals that get loose, like goats fall in this category, dogs fall in this category, cats fall in this category, snakes, different types of pythons and boas, depending on where at in the U.S. If they were domesticated animals and they've gotten out into the wild, they become feral, and they start wreaking havoc on human society, whether it's being disruptive, eating food sources, causing soil erosion, impacting food chains for other native animals in that area. Those would be considered feral populations, and those would be invasive. Usually if you have an invasive species and it's not able to be regulated by that native or by that particular ecosystem that it is an invasive in, that's why it's going to be that's when it's going to cause negative impacts, and that's why it's going to be called invasive. If it were an animal that's an alien species, that or an organism that came over from, say, China, that's native to China, and somehow it got out here in the U.S. or here in Texas, but there's no natural predator to regulate that animal or that plant from propagating and spreading and taking over areas where native plants or animals would be, if there's no predator to regulate that, that's where the negative impact is going to come from. Environmental harm. So we looked at some economic impact. Environmental harm, obviously, was what I just mentioned. If there's no regulating predator that can help monitor naturally the growth of that particular invasive or alien species, that alien species takes over. It actually starts eating native plants or other native animals that are part of that natural food chain, so disrupting that food chain. That's when there's going to be economic problems. That's going to get into maybe eating plants that helped regulate pH in soil or helped regulate soil erosion, or animals that helped do that, and it's taking over those particular parts of an ecosystem. Then you're going to have economic or environmental issues because of soil degradation or because of species loss. As far as human impacts, obviously the economic side of it, the money, how much it's going to cost to regulate. There can also be other impacts to human society: respiratory infections, reactions to poisonous plants that aren't native, the decreased soil stabilization through soil degradation, runoff, loss of soil for the growth of plants and crops. Certain instances where it increases wildfire frequency, unbalancing the carrying capacity of wildlife for, like, say, livestock grazing, or impacting livestock, which is going to impact our food sources. Those would be examples of additional impacts that they can cause human society. Definitely, if you have problems with this stuff, that's going to cause that could link into, say, property values. If you started having an invasive species show up in an area where your home is, causing issues with increased wildfires or soil degradation, which means your foundation can be affected and you have to pay money to fix your foundation, or poisonous plants that aren't native start creeping up and they can't be regulated, or wild animals that start popping up that can't be regulated, that are invasive. Those would all have a big impact on property value and business opportunities, fishing practices. A lot of different things can be impacted through the human value side of it.